Imagine a crowd cheering as a pig in a man's coat is led to the gallows, its ears sliced to match a child's torn face. That wasn't a fable. In 1386, at Falaise, a sow was mutilated and hanged for killing a toddler, the scene memorialized on a church wall. In 1474, Basil burned a rooster alive for the crime of laying an egg, proof, they feared, of a demon's birth. And when weevils chewed French vineyards, courts hired lawyers to defend the bugs. This isn't satire. It's justice, medieval style, bloody, solemn, and bizarre. Ready to see how reason went feral? Let's plunge into the twisted truth. You think justice is blind? In the Middle Ages, it wasn't just blind, it was rabid, snarling, and sometimes wearing hooves. Imagine this: a courtroom in France, 1386. The accused shuffles in, not a man, not even a woman, but a pig. A full-grown sow dragged before the judge for the horrific crime of killing a child. And this wasn't some quick punishment in the barnyard. No, the pig was given the full works: indictment, defense counsel, witnesses. The court even spent money dressing it in a coat and gloves, as though it were a gentleman about to hang. When the verdict came, guilty, the sow was mutilated to match the child's wounds and strung up on the gallows in front of a roaring crowd. Church bells tolled. The spectacle was considered justice, not madness. And here's the twist: this wasn't an isolated freak show. Over 200 such trials are recorded in medieval Europe. Pigs, goats, horses, even insects were formally tried, sentenced, and punished in public ceremonies meant to prove that divine order still ruled. Picture the absurdity: a weevil with a lawyer. Yet to these townsfolk, it was deadly serious, a way to project human morality onto beasts that were seen as part of God's legal universe. Sound insane? Wait until you hear what happened when the defendants weren't pigs at all, but swarms of bugs. Because even insects were summoned to stand before the law. In one case from Autumn, France, the proceedings dragged on for months while the judge issued repeated summons for the rats to appear. Every session ended with the lawyer insisting his clients had legitimate excuses. Imagine the sheer theater of it. Clerks drafting official notices to rodents, townsfolk nodding gravely as if justice was being served. The absurdity becomes even darker when you realize people starved while these trials wasted time. Vineyards were dying, grain stores were empty, but magistrates poured their energy into chasing mice through paperwork. The irony? These lawyers sometimes won. Judges occasionally declared that animals should be given new fields to graze in, or that peasants should plant sacrificial crops for pests, effectively bargaining with vermin. It was the medieval version of negotiating with terrorists, except the terrorists were beetles. But here's the real twist. This wasn't seen as silly. It was sacred. The church taught that all creatures had souls and could sin. A domestic pig that killed a child? Guilty of murder. Insects destroying vines? Guilty of theft from God's bounty. Punishing them wasn't just law. It was spiritual warfare. Now think of it in modern terms. Imagine dragging a cockroach into small claims court because it ate your leftovers. Ridiculous, right? Yet in medieval Europe, this was considered a rational, godly response. And if you thought courtroom vermin were strange, wait until you see what happened to a rooster that dared to do something unnatural. You've seen chickens strut around a farmyard, harmless and stupid. But in Basel, Switzerland, 1474, one rooster committed a crime so heinous that it was dragged before a judge. The charge? Laying an egg. Yes, you heard that right. This bird was accused of witchcraft, because only demons, people believed, could cause a male rooster to lay. An egg laid by a rooster was thought to hatch a cockatrice, a monstrous serpent-bird hybrid capable of killing with a glance. So the townsfolk gathered. The rooster was placed on trial, a clerk read out the charges, and the judges deliberated. Their verdict? Guilty. The sentence? To be burned alive, egg and all. Witnesses described the execution as grimly solemn, with priests chanting as the bird was tossed into the flames. For them, this wasn't animal cruelty. It was exorcism. Better to kill one unlucky rooster than risk birthing Satan's favorite monster. Here's the twist. People genuinely believed this was necessary. They saw themselves as defending Christendom from the forces of hell, one chicken coop at a time. Compare it to today. If a hen laid a double yolk egg, we'd Instagram it. In 1474, they saw it as the opening act of the apocalypse. But believe it or not, even this feathered nightmare pales next to what happened when swarms of insects became the villains. Entire towns held processions, exorcisms, and, get this, banishments for bugs. If you thought one rooster at the stake was bizarre, imagine an entire swarm of bugs getting banished like criminals. In 1478, in the Swiss town of Bern, a group of beetle larvae were hauled into court, at least symbolically. Since the larvae couldn't exactly crawl into the dock, a bailiff read out a summons, demanding their appearance. Of course, the insects failed to appear, so the court tried them in absentia. The verdict? Guilty. The sentence? Exile from the vineyards. Judges literally declared the larvae must leave the territory within 6 days or face anathema, essentially a death sentence issued by priests with holy curses. And this wasn't just a Swiss oddity. French records from Saint-Julien, 1587, describe weevils being put on trial for destroying grape crops. The case dragged on for years. The bugs had not one but 2 defense attorneys. Those lawyers actually argued their clients were following God's natural law by eating what he provided, and therefore couldn't be condemned. Some even suggested the villagers plant alternative fields just for the weevils. Can you picture that? A medieval peace treaty between farmers and insects. But here's the darker undertone. These ceremonies weren't jokes. They were deadly serious, binding whole communities in the belief that God's justice applied to every living thing. The farmers prayed, the judges ruled, the priests cursed, and still the vineyards withered. And if you think exiling bugs was surreal, wait until you hear how pigs, the medieval repeat offenders, became the most common defendants of all. Pigs were the true villains of medieval courtrooms. Not because they were particularly aggressive, but because they lived closest to humans. They wandered through towns, rooting in garbage, sometimes sleeping near children. And when hunger or chance struck, tragedy followed. The chronicles are filled with stories of pigs killing infants left unattended. For us, it's a grim accident. For them, it was murder. The most infamous case took place in Falaise, Normandy, 1386. A sow mauled a child to death. Instead of being slaughtered quietly, she was tried like a person. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and a defense lawyer was assigned. When guilt was declared, the punishment was chillingly theatrical. The pig's snout and ears were sliced to resemble the wounds she had inflicted. Then, dressed in a man's jacket and white gloves, she was paraded to the gallows and publicly hanged. The execution was commemorated in artwork on the walls of the local church, proof that this was not shameful but righteous justice. And this wasn't a one-off. In 1266, records show a pig was burned at the stake in Fontenay-aux-Roses for killing a child. In Savigny, a sow and her 6 piglets were condemned after trampling a boy. The piglets were acquitted for lack of evidence, but their mother was executed. Even the language of acquittal mimicked human law. Here's the irony. The more pigs killed children, the more seriously courts took their culpability. In a way, swine became the most criminally overrepresented species in medieval Europe. But if you think pigs on gallows are disturbing, the next twist is worse. Sometimes, animals were tortured before execution. Just like humans, torture wasn't reserved for humans. Medieval courts sometimes treated animals exactly like condemned criminals, meaning they could be beaten, mutilated, and displayed before death. Take the 15th century case in France where a sow that had killed a child had its snout gashed open and ears sliced off to mirror the victim's wounds. This wasn't punishment alone. It was symbolism, a grotesque parody of justice. The animal was forced to carry the child's injuries as part of its sentence. In other towns, animals were flogged publicly before execution. Some were paraded through the streets in chains, whipped as the crowd jeered. There are accounts of donkeys, bulls, even dogs being scourged in marketplaces. The point wasn't deterrence. It was ritual humiliation. The audience wasn't supposed to learn a lesson about animals behaving better. They were meant to see divine order upheld through spectacle. Think of the absurdity: whipping a beast that had no concept of sin, then dragging it to the gallows as though the crowd could sleep easier, knowing a cosmic balance had been restored. It was less about animals and more about humans projecting their own rage, their need to see justice as performance. Today, we find dog owners when their pets bite. Back then, they mutilated the dog itself. To them, it wasn't cruelty. It was theology with teeth. And if torture seems like the peak of insanity, just wait. Sometimes animals weren't punished individually. They were tried collectively, as if whole species were criminal conspiracies. Now imagine this: an entire species dragged into court. In 1545, near Lausanne, Switzerland, villagers brought charges not against a single beast, but against a plague of caterpillars. They were summoned formally, with documents nailed to church doors demanding their appearance. Of course, the caterpillars didn't show. So the court tried them in absentia, calling witnesses to testify about the devastation of crops. Priests thundered sermons condemning the insects as agents of Satan. Finally, the judge declared the verdict. The caterpillars were guilty of theft and destruction and sentenced to banishment. They were ordered to leave the fields within 6 days, like squatters evicted by divine decree. And the bizarre part? People believed it worked. When a new swarm appeared the next summer, priests explained that these were different caterpillars, not the exiled ones. That's how desperate people were to make sense of natural disaster. They preferred cosmic lawsuits to scientific reasoning. France had its own spectacles. In the 1580s, a vineyard in Saint-Julien spent years prosecuting weevils. The insects were assigned 2 defense lawyers, who argued that God created them, so they had as much right to eat grapes as humans did to drink wine. Some records even show proposals to plant alternative vineyards just for the bugs. A medieval peace treaty between man and insect. It sounds like comedy. But to starving peasants, it was deadly serious, proof that law extended from the king's justice all the way down to a crawling larva. But if insects could be banished, imagine what happened when animals were executed like nobles, complete with clothing and ceremonies. Executions weren't just punishments, they were theater. And animals got star billing. When that pig in Falaise was hanged in 1386, it wasn't enough to drag her to the gallows naked. Officials spent money dressing her in a jacket, breeches, and white gloves on her hooves. The message was clear. She had committed a human crime, so she would die a human death. Townspeople watched in eerie silence as the pig swung from the rope, her body jerking like any thief or murderer. Other cases went even further. In 1499 in France, a bull that had gored a man was led to execution, accompanied by priests chanting litanies. The bull was decorated with garlands before being slaughtered, half execution, half grotesque parody of a festival. Records even note towns paying for special coffins for executed beasts, as though granting dignity in death after ritual humiliation. Why go to such lengths? Because these events weren't about animals. They were about people seeing themselves in the spectacle. By dressing a pig in clothes, the community reaffirmed its belief that sin and justice applied universally. It wasn't just a sow dangling from the rope. It was the devil himself, symbolically purged through flesh. Think of it like a medieval version of a blockbuster. The costumes, the ceremony, the public square. It was entertainment as much as punishment. Only instead of popcorn, people bought bread and ale while their neighbors' livestock swung in the breeze. And if this looks like savage pantomime, wait until you hear how theology twisted these trials into a cosmic necessity. Why did anyone believe animals could even be guilty? The answer lies in medieval theology. The Church taught that all creatures were part of God's order. If humans sinned, why not animals? Priests preached that domestic beasts, living alongside mankind, were morally accountable because they shared in human society. A pig that killed a child hadn't just acted on instinct. It had committed sin, almost as if possessed by the devil. Wild wolves or rats might get off easier because they lived outside man's world. But your barnyard pig? It was expected to know better. This thinking turned barns into battlegrounds between good and evil. To condemn a cow wasn't cruelty. It was exorcism. Executing a pig wasn't about vengeance on livestock. It was about purging Satan's corruption from the community. Priests often blessed the gallows before an animal execution, as though the beast were both criminal and heretic. The logic sounds deranged, but in a world racked by famine, plague, and war, people craved order. Trials gave chaos a script. They reassured villagers that God's justice still ruled, even if it meant sentencing a donkey. Imagine how powerless you'd feel when locusts devoured your only harvest. What better comfort than seeing a judge slam a gavel and pronounce the bugs guilty of theft? So when we laugh today, we miss the deeper truth. These weren't just absurdities. They were rituals of survival, spiritual armor against a hostile world. But if theology sanctified the madness, communities also demanded spectacle, and that's when animal trials became pure carnival. Public executions of animals became as much carnival as courtroom. Picture it. The market square packed, vendors selling bread and ale, children hoisted onto shoulders to get a better view. The condemned? A donkey in chains or a dog muzzled with rope. Execution days were treated as holidays. Schools closed, work paused. People came not only to watch justice but to be entertained. Chroniclers describe crowds jeering at pigs as they were flogged, tossing rotten vegetables at cows condemned for trampling. Theatrical touches, bells ringing, priests chanting, executioners dressed in bright scarlet, turned these moments into grotesque pageants. Sometimes musicians even played. It was part horror show, part morality play, reminding everyone that disobedience, whether by man or beast, would meet the rope or the fire. And here's the darkly comic twist. While the townsfolk applauded, criminals worked the crowd. Pickpockets prowled the festival atmosphere, stealing purses while everyone gawked at the gallows. Imagine it. Justice unfolding on the scaffold, while crime flourished in the audience. Children weren't shielded either. Parents believed exposing them to these spectacles would burn morality into their souls. See, son, that's what happens if you disobey. It was medieval Sesame Street, except the alphabet lesson was taught by a screaming pig in human clothes. But these carnivals carried a sinister undertone, because sometimes the spectacle wasn't enough. Towns wanted confessions, even from animals, and that meant dragging beasts into torture chambers designed for men. Yes, you heard that right. Confessions. Medieval courts sometimes demanded that animals confess their sins before execution, just as humans did. Chroniclers mention pigs being interrogated, their squeals interpreted as proof of guilt. In one notorious French case, clerks recorded that a condemned sow remained obstinate in her wickedness, as though the poor beast had refused to admit its crime. The irony is so grotesque it borders on comedy, except the people watching weren't laughing. To them, the pig's refusal was further evidence that Satan had hardened its heart. And when squeals weren't enough, torture was applied. A donkey accused of kicking its owner was chained, beaten, and starved before being hanged. Dogs had their ears cropped and tails cut off before the final blow. These weren't punishments to fit crimes. They were rehearsals of human justice inflicted on beasts. The logic was that if animals were treated like people, then divine law had been honored. Here's the surreal twist. In some cases, animals did escape death through confession. Records show piglets being acquitted because they were too young to understand sin. It reads like a parody of mercy, but the townsfolk considered it profound proof that the courts could distinguish innocence from guilt. Today, we'd call this institutionalized madness. Back then, it was civic duty wrapped in ritual. But the most unsettling part, these trials weren't dying traditions. They thrived for centuries, even as Europe marched into the so-called Age of Reason. You'd expect this madness to fade as Europe entered the Renaissance, an era of learning and reason. Wrong. Animal trials not only continued into the 16th century, they actually expanded. In 1576, the village of Saint-Julien spent years prosecuting weevils that ravaged its vineyards. Years. 2 defense lawyers represented the bugs. They argued the insects were God's creatures, entitled to food like humans. Judges debated whether to set aside special fields where the weevils could feed without harming the wine crop. Think about that. While plague and war raged, human courts seriously negotiated land deals with insects. And the documents survive. Petitions, rebuttals, judgments, all written with solemnity, as if Cicero himself were arguing. When the villagers demanded the bugs be exterminated, lawyers pushed back, warning that killing God's creation would bring divine wrath. The case dragged on until the vineyards collapsed from blight, not judgment. Essentially, the weevils won. Here's the bitter irony. During these very decades, European courts were also executing people for witchcraft. In some places, children accused of dancing in moonlight were burned while lawyers saved beetles from extermination. Human life was treated as disposable, insect life as legally defensible. It exposes a mindset both chilling and darkly comic. Justice wasn't about fairness. It was about ritual, about showing that every crime, whether committed by man, pig, or caterpillar, had its day in court. But as absurd as these cases sound, they reveal something deeper. These trials weren't jokes. They were tools of control, keeping terrified societies in line. Control, that's the real heart of it. When a pig was hanged or a swarm of bugs exiled, the audience wasn't just watching punishment. They were watching their leaders assert mastery over chaos. In a world where famine, plague, and war struck without warning, law had to look bigger than human quarrels. It had to reach into the barnyard and the vineyard, taming even nature itself. These trials reassured people that their suffering wasn't random, that if God's court could prosecute vermin, then maybe he was still watching. Think of it as medieval propaganda. Town councils staged animal trials to show authority. Priests blessed them to reinforce doctrine, and the people paid attention because their very survival depended on believing order existed. A pig wasn't just a pig. It became the scapegoat for death, hunger, and sin. Killing it in public was like saying, "See, we still control this world." The dark comedy is that it often backfired. When a plague of locusts returned after a grandiose excommunication, villagers sometimes whispered that the bugs had defied the church. Imagine the unease. If even insects could ignore God's justice, what hope was left for man? It's here that these trials become most revealing. They weren't just spectacles of cruelty. They were psychological bandages for a society on the brink. But beneath the chanting and the pomp, a question festered. Who was really on trial, the animals or the people desperate enough to believe in their guilt? By the 17th century, cracks finally began to show. As legal systems grew more complex and science started to nibble away at superstition, some judges began to see these animal trials for what they were: ritualized absurdity. Yet they didn't vanish overnight. Records show animal prosecutions still occurring in parts of France and Switzerland well into the 1600s. One final case in Burgundy dragged on for years over weevils, with lawyers trading theological arguments about whether God intended grapes for men or beetles. While philosophers like Descartes were writing about rationalism, entire towns still gathered to hear verdicts against vermin. What killed the practice wasn't compassion for animals, it was embarrassment. As the Enlightenment dawned, intellectuals mocked these trials as relics of barbarism. Courts that once solemnly banished insects began shifting to practical pest control. But the impulse behind them never fully disappeared. We still create scapegoats, still invent enemies to project our fears onto. The only difference is that today, we put people, or whole groups, into the dock instead of pigs and beetles. Think about it. A viral video of a dog attacking someone today sparks online fury, calls for the animal to be put down, petitions demanding justice. We pretend it's different, but the same hunger for punishment, justice as spectacle, still lurks in us. In other words, the last animal trial wasn't really in the 17th century. It continues every time we demand vengeance over understanding, theater over truth. So, what do these bizarre spectacles really tell us? Not about animals, they never understood the noose around their necks, but about humans. When a pig was dressed in a jacket, when a rooster was burned alive, when beetles were summoned by parchment nailed to church doors, it was people on trial for their own terror. Medieval society was teetering on the edge of starvation and plague. Law had to look omnipotent, even if it meant inventing crimes for creatures who couldn't speak. And here's the darkest irony. These trials often said more about power than piety. Local lords and bishops seized the chance to show off their authority. By condemning a beast, they reassured their people that human rulers could command even nature. The stage-managed hangings and excommunications weren't about pigs or insects. They were propaganda, just like a king's execution or a heretic's burning. In many ways, animal trials were the dry run for the witch craze that followed. The same logic, that evil could hide anywhere, even in the most unlikely vessel, fueled both. A sow could be guilty of murder. A widow could be guilty of dancing with the devil. And once guilt was declared, the only answer was fire, rope, or the sword. So when we laugh at the absurdity of insects with lawyers, we should remember, the joke is on us. Because the same mindset, fear dressed up as justice, has never really left. From pigs swinging on gallows to beetles banished with legal decrees, we've trudged through one of history's strangest graveyards of justice. What began as an earnest attempt to enforce God's law on earth, twisted into a centuries-long theater of the absurd. But beneath the dark humor lies something far more unsettling. These trials reveal how fragile human reason becomes when fear takes the driver's seat. Think back to the sow of Falaise, mutilated to mirror a child's wounds, dressed in gloves, then hanged as the crowd cheered, or the rooster in Basel, burned alive for the crime of laying an egg. These weren't anomalies. They were ritual, rehearsed again and again across Europe for 4 centuries. Farmers starved, vineyards rotted, yet lawyers stood in court solemnly defending bugs. Judges read out summons to caterpillars. Priests thundered at weevils as if Satan himself had gnawed through the grapevines. Why? Because people needed order in a world that seemed built on chaos. So plague could wipe out half a city overnight. Crops could fail without warning. Children could die in their cradles. By dragging animals into court, medieval towns convinced themselves that chaos had rules, that if even pigs and rats answered to justice, maybe the universe wasn't so indifferent after all. It was a coping mechanism disguised as theology. The brutality was part of the package. Public hangings of animals weren't about punishing pigs, they were about calming humans. Theatrical mutilations, confessions forced from squealing beasts, priests blessing gallows, all of it reassured terrified people that evil had a face and that the law could still strike it down. When the rope snapped tight, when the flames licked feathers, the crowd wasn't just entertained. They felt protected. And yet, how different are we? We no longer dress pigs in breeches, but we still demand justice as theater. A viral dog attack sparks online outrage. Politicians demonize entire groups with the same logic once aimed at vermin. They're a danger to society. They must be punished, expelled, destroyed. Our courts don't summon caterpillars anymore, but we summon scapegoats with frightening regularity. Fear still craves ritual. The real horror isn't the gullibility of the past. It's the mirror it holds up to the present. Medieval people weren't stupid. They were desperate. And desperation breeds spectacle. When life is cheap and terrifying, punishment becomes performance. That's why pigs were hanged like nobles, why bugs got lawyers, why chickens were torched like witches. Justice wasn't blind. It was frantic, flailing, and eager to put on a show. So here's the lesson. When you see a crowd baying for blood, whether in a medieval square or on modern social media, ask yourself, who's really on trial? The accused? Or the fear inside the mob that needs an outlet? Because that's what medieval animal trials prove. People will put anything in the dock if it makes them feel safer, even for a moment. From pigs in coats to exiled beetles, from mutilated sows to lawyers pleading mercy for mice, these stories are grotesque, comic, and horrifying all at once. They remind us that civilization is a fragile veneer. Scratch it with hunger, plague, or paranoia, and suddenly the absurd seems reasonable. Suddenly a pig is a murderer, a rooster a sorcerer, an insect a thief. Suddenly cruelty feels like salvation. And maybe that's the scariest part, because the same impulse still lingers in us. We might not hang pigs, but we still scapegoat, still put on trials that are more performance than justice. The costumes have changed. The fear hasn't. So the next time you laugh at the image of a beetle with a lawyer, remember, those medieval townsfolk weren't laughing. They were deadly serious, and in their desperation, they revealed a truth that still haunts us. That humans will invent any theater, no matter how cruel or absurd, to convince themselves the world makes sense. Now it's your turn. Comment the part that shocked you the most. Subscribe for more brutally honest history, and like this video if you're glad you weren't born in the Dark Ages.